Your Excellencies, dear friends, a good morning and good afternoon. I should say good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you present in the room with us today and to our online audience. I am Zaid Rad Al Hussein, the president of the International Peace Institute, and I am thrilled and delighted to be here this afternoon and be joined by the Swiss mission to the United Nations, Ambassador Bereswell. We're delighted that you're here, and it's terrific you have brought also a distinguished group from Switzerland to inform us about the issue we'll be discussing today. We're also delighted that the International Gender Champions are going to be part of this in partnership with us for this side event at the start of the beginning of the 67th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. The theme of this year's CSW, as you know, is innovation and technological change and education in the digital age for achieving gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls. And today's panel addresses this topic from different angles and includes perspectives from the UN, academia, the private sector, and non-governmental organizations. And a central message of today, we hope, is that all women and girls need access to digital technologies, need to be represented in the digital space, and finally, need to be safe to fully participate online and offline. And for many across the world, to be enabled to do this, of course, access in other realms is needed, access to electricity, to health, to literacy, to computer literacy, to good governance with a strong social conscience by states, by the internet providers, and by social media. And part of the discussion, I have no doubt, will be on the prevalence of this odious hatred that we see expressed in too many parts. And will someone please talk to Elon Musk and educate him, educate him, because he seems to unwittingly be in a position where misogyny that is so in evidence across the world will be supercharged if Twitter doesn't get its act together. It must change. I believe this discussion, like the one we'll have today, will make a positive contribution to it. And I wish you all a fruitful and positive session to come. And I would like now to invite Ambassador Bereswell to take the floor. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Zaid, Excellencies, dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. It is my great honor, and I'm very excited to welcome you to this side event at IPI today, a long-standing partner of Switzerland. And I would like to thank personally Prince Zaid, IPI's president, for making this possible and for the excellent collaboration in the lead up to this event between all the teams here. You are a true gender champion and an important member of the International Gender Champions Network, which is a partner for this event too. We are here today because we are painfully aware that gender inequality persists around the globe. The latest available data on Sustainable Development Goal 5 confirms again that the world is not on track to achieve gender equality by 2030. Based on the current rate of change, it would take up to 286 years, and we simply do not have so much time to waste the incredible potential of half of the world. So this year's priority theme of the CSW is at the same time key and very timely. The public discourse tends to focus on the negative aspects of new technologies on women's rights. And indeed, all too often, and we are going to hear more about that, new technologies fuel discrimination and gender-based violence. Artificial intelligence tends to mirror the gender bias of the real world and further exacerbates these biases. Online harassment, hate speech, and other forms of cyber violence mainly affect women and girls. However, new technologies also offer important opportunities to advance human rights. There are numerous initiatives which use innovative technological tools to advance gender equality. Making use of such tools is central to the UN's work. based on the normative imperative to advance gender equality across all its pillars. My country is strongly committed to harnessing the potential of new technologies and has often been a pioneer already. For instance, we developed the very first smartphone application for the UN community. It sounds like back in history. So in line with our priority on the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, my country has developed the Women, Peace and Security app in collaboration with Liechtenstein and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It analyzes the Council's engagement on women, peace and security and tracks the progress of states and international organizations in its implementation. And it has been updated in fall 2021, and I hope that you are all going to use it even more now. We also developed the Women's Human Rights app with the University of Bern for the CSW. This is a unique database and reference tool to search for language on gender equality and women's rights adopted by consensus at the UN. It is supposed to make it easier for negotiators to access relevant texts and thus contribute to efficient solutions. And I would like to mention also that we developed the so-called LOGIP tool to promote equal pay for women and men in companies in our country and all over the world. This digital tool allows companies to carry out free equal pay analysis in an objective and confidential manner. So, Excellencies, colleagues, the potential of new technologies can only be fully harnessed if all actors in society work together toward this goal. So I'm very, very happy that we take that to the next level today with this extremely distinguished and brilliant panel. And I'm very pleased that we will hear from representatives of international organizations, the academic community, the private sector and civil society, all of whom are committed in their own way to making the most of new technologies to advance gender equality and promote women's rights. And I'm proud that we have again also some brilliant Swiss pioneers with us today. And you know, I'm always stressed out my staff when I have to make speeches and ask them I want a quote or a story. And so this morning I thought, well, I will find a cool quote on gender and tech. So I just used Google and then I got 100,000 quotes on tech and so many on women or gender, but not one single quote on women and tech. So I think that speaks for itself. So once again, thank you to IPI and its president for hosting us today and to all the panelists for their contributions. I look forward to a lively debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's really a pleasure, as always, to work with the Permanent Mission of Switzerland to the United Nations and also to our partners at the International Gender Champions. Good afternoon. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI's Vice President, and it is really just wonderful to see everybody here in person at IPI for CSW. CSW is always really, in my view, a very special time around IPI and around the UN, in particular for all the robust civil society engagement that you get around this time of year. So it's something that we really welcome and cherish. And so it is my pleasure to moderate this session, which, as was explained, hits really squarely on the priority theme of CSW 67. I think it was really important that the ambassador mentioned that too often we focus only on the negative side of this issue when new technology also offers new opportunities to advance gender equality and human rights. And so we're going to be having a tremendous conversation here today. I believe we've already started it a bit in the pre-meeting to ask, how can we in fact use innovation and technology to advance, and I would say indeed accelerate, as we noted, there has been progress, but not enough, to achieve gender equality. And we have this incredible panel here to discuss all of this and to provide further concrete examples. We already heard a number from the Swiss ambassador on a number of tools that have been developed. So we have here with us Undersecretary General Amandeep Singh Gill, Secretary General's Envoy on Technology, Professor Iris Bonet of Harvard University, Dr. Annabella Basler of Equal Voice, Ringer AG, and Sophie Ackerman from Stop Hate Speech and Alliance F. We will start with the Undersecretary General. Amandeep was appointed by the Secretary General in June 22 before taking up the position as Undersecretary General and UN Envoy on Technology. Mr. Gill was CEO of International Digital Health and Artificial Intelligence Research Collaborative Project based at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, where actually we first met, I recall. In 2018, 2019, Mr. Gill was Executive Director and co-lead of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation. And between 2016 and 2018, he was India's permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, a vast array of experience. So, Mr. Undersecretary General, the question that we've posed to you is if you could tell us how the upcoming Global Digital Compact can contribute to addressing the gender digital divide. Amanda, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam. And I also want to thank Switzerland for putting this together and to RPI for hosting us today for this very important discussion right at the start of the CSW week, which, by the way, started over the weekend. It's been exciting. The Global Digital Compact is proposed for the Summit of the Future in 2024. So we are still at a very early stage. This is a consultation phase, which Sweden and Rwanda are co-facilitating. So we are listening, gathering inputs. But already we can see that there are themes that have emerged in the inputs during the consultations. And each and every one of those themes has a gender dimension. So gender is cross-cutting, just as the human rights aspect is cross-cutting, or the sustainable development goals aspect is cross-cutting. So gender is a cross-cutting theme. And just at a previous panel today, I said that what works well for women will work well for the world. So if we can get the gender side right, I think we can obviously fix some of the problems that we face with the digital world today. Those themes in the compact include digital inclusion and connectivity. So we see the gender digital divide there. Access overall, depending on which organization and which metric you use, there is a 8 to 12% gap. In developing countries, it may be higher, sometimes double that much. There is a gap in terms of access to devices as well, affordability, meaningful content, and so on. Then if you look at the theme of internet fragmentation, internet governance, again, internet shutdowns today in many places prevent people from exercising their human rights, including women and girls from accessing information, sometimes sensitive information, from participating in movements to assert their rights. Just think of the Me Too movement, because tech is not only dystopian, it is also empowering and enabling. And then if you look at data and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, there's a significant gender dimension. Gender disaggregated data is not always there. Algorithms reflect some of the masculinity, some of the stereotypes and biases that are already there. And then if you go on to issues related to the leveraging of digital technologies for development, we see already that the exclusion of women from the digital world is imposing $1 trillion cost on global GDP. So we are missing out on a lot of innovation, a lot of economic value that could be coming from one half of humanity. So these are some of the issues that the Global Digital Compact would be going into. And I think at the end of the day, it's not only about fixing some of the difficulties we see on the gender agenda, the gender discrimination, technology facilitated violence, gender-based violence, but it's also about leveraging the power of women and girls to get global digital governance right, to get global digital cooperation right. So I'll stop there, Adam. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I think that really makes the point exactly. What works for women works well for the world. It's not just about fixing the problems. It's about leveraging the power of women and girls for innovation and for sustainable development. Wonderful. We will now turn to Iris Bonet, who is the Albert Pratt Professor of Business and Government and the co-director of the Women and Public Policy Program at Harvard Kennedy School. She is the author of What Works? Gender Equality by Design. She was appointed to the Gender Equality Advisory Council of the G7 in 2021 and named one of the most influential academics in government and one of the most influential people in gender policy by Apolitical. Professor Bonnet also served as academic dean of Harvard Kennedy School from 2011 2014 and came back for a second tour in 2018 2021. You are a behavioral economist, is my understanding. So what the question we've posed to you is what are some of the tech innovations that have come out of behavioral economics to combat both gender and racial biases? Professor, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this very kind and generous introduction. And thank you to IPI for hosting us here. And thank you to the Ambassador of Switzerland to the UN for having brought us together, really. So it's a big pleasure to be here. So let me, I'm going to make 3 points, but let me take us back just a couple of months at the end of last year. Some of you might have noted something that I thought was quite newsworthy, and that was that the first female car crash dummy was developed. So I'm going to repeat that. Cars have been around for about 140 years. For about 140 years, we have not tested whether our seat belts, our safety features in cars, and even just how the cars are built work for female bodies. So that's, of course, an example of exclusion of biased samples, of data insufficiency. But I think it drives home this first point that I'd like to make. And of course, it's not a point that I'm the first one to make, and that is we really, really have to create technology in an inclusive way. And that starts, of course, with the data that we use. We can't use biased data, whether that's in how we develop our algorithms, how we test our algorithms, how we develop our cars, how we develop our medicine, our drugs, whether we actually evaluate their impact on men and women, et cetera, et cetera. So representative sampling is incredibly important for technology. My second point is now, I'm taking us kind of on an uplifting journey here, and that is, I'm actually incredibly optimistic about technology. And so much of my work takes place at the intersection of gender equity, but also more generally, I want to say diversity and inclusion work and behavioral science. So it's at that, like kind of that middle point, that intersection that really interests me. And, we know human minds are biased, and we know our biases can be easily translated into technology. But the beauty of technology is we could actually test an algorithm, and we could easily find out why certain people are differently treated by an algorithm. It is much harder to test and train millions and millions of people who make those biased decisions every day. And that's, in fact, what really intrigues me about technology. It also helps us embed change in our systems. So, post George Floyd, in particular in this country, systemic change has become a bit of a slogan, right? Don't fix people, fix systems. And I absolutely subscribe to that. We should absolutely fix systems and not try to fix people. It's also much harder to fix people. But technology helps us change how we do things at work overnight. And so let me give you a few just simple examples. So we do know that so think about the hiring process. So first stage in the hiring process is recruitment. So we do know that many of our recruitment efforts are limited because we use biased language in our job advertisements. That's a simple problem, actually, a relatively simple problem to fix. We'll talk about more harder problems my colleague will talk about a little later, harder problems, but that's not just a hard one. So we can have an algorithm run it over everything we write, not just our job ads, but also, for example, our letters of recommendation, which I'm doing now, to highlight to me whether I use gender stereotypic language, for example, that will exclude certain people, for example, from applying. We can use similar insights from behavioral science, that was specifically your question, in helping us screen and evaluate our job candidates more effectively. And just to give you one example, many of us feel that we are incredibly good at interviewing people. Now, sadly, the evidence suggests that we are all terrible, terrible at that. So in fact, what is one of the best predictors of future performance, and that doesn't sound like rocket science, it is a work sample test. Have someone write some code if you want to hire a coder. Have someone give a speech, give a lesson if you want to hire a communicator or a teacher or a professor for that matter. So there are now tools out there. One is called Applied, for example, that was developed in the UK that help employers kind of start with the descriptions of the job and then move from description to the job to the skills that we look in the future employee, to the tasks that that person actually has to do, and then develop those tasks as job sample tests that then these applicants can take. So that's, I think, where the beauty of technology is, and that's where that intersection is of behavioral science, that being informed a little bit about how our minds work, where these biases occur, we can help make our evaluation systems more effective. And when I say more effective, I actually mean both, right? Because sometimes, not always, sometimes we really are in a total win-win world, in that these tools help us choose the people who will be most successful in the job. And just almost as a side effect, they will help us diversify because we want to choose the types of people we've always chosen or who conform to our stereotypes. So I think that's the beauty of embedding technology in how we do things every day, whether that's developing a crash dummy or whether that is thinking about how we hire people, or whether that is, in my case, teaching a class. I now have a simple tool, it's called Teachly, that helps me make sure I call on everyone in the class. You've all probably been in a classroom at some point. You remember those eager beavers. They have their hand up very quickly, and it's hard not to call on them right away. But technology filters back to me after class who I actually called on, and will tell me, you're overcalling women, you're overcalling people whose first language is English, you're overcalling people, in my case, by the way, my bias was the right-hand side. I undercalled on the right-hand side. Well, you might think it's political, but it actually has to do with my hearing. I don't hear well in my right ear. And so I, instinctively, not knowledgeably, instinctively tried to avoid calling on the people on the right-hand side because I felt I might not understand them quite as well. That was not something that I knew, but that, I think, again, is the beauty of data, of measuring, of technology, making it easy for me to get things right. But I have to make one more comment quickly on embedding, and that is, technology is a tool. AI is a tool. Crash Car Dummy is a tool. In order for embedding to work, and we just talked about that actually in our pre-discussion, we also have to motivate people to actually get this right. And I wanted to tell you, actually share with you one of my very favorite studies that focuses on that intersection of how can you actually create change that is good for the world, good for the people, and just good overall. And that is research looking at increasing economic opportunities for women in India. And it's a long story, long paper, of course, as you might imagine. It's a randomized controlled trial. But one of the outcomes is that parents in those villages where women had better work opportunities started to treat their 0 to 5-year-old daughters better, right? So survival chances of 0 to 5-year-old kids improved because women had economic opportunities. And that's sometimes hard to say, that even the poorest of the poor care about returns on their investments. And so anyway, so my last point, embedding important representative samples is important. My very last point, but that's close to my heart, is, of course, the bar for technology has to be incredibly high. That means, and that's, I think, where we have failed collectively. I think collectively, academia, public sector, private sector, you have to test. And we can learn from other similar environments, like Food and Drug Administration in this country does tests on a drug before it is released on the public. We need to do that for much of the technology that we are using, including our algorithms. We need actually to test whether women, whether people of color, whether people of certain nationalities, of certain sizes, whether they're affected differently by what we're doing, and then correct our algorithms. And that's kind of my last point. So let's use representative samples. Let's embed technology in the things we're doing. And finally, let's test.
Fantastic. Don't. It's easy. We were describing an algorithm earlier today as like a dog, and so maybe think it's easier to train technology than to train people. Don't fix people, fix systems. But what's interesting to me about what you're saying is that the human element remains incredibly important. That this example of the tech filtering it back to you, and you ultimately having to make the decision. In order for this embedded technology to work, you have to motivate people to make it work. So we often think of technology as taking over, but actually the human element remains really, really important. Wonderful. We'll now turn to Dr. Annabella Basler, who has been CFO of Ringier AG since June 2012. In addition, she was responsible for the company's activities in Romania from mid-2014 until 2021. In November 2019, she initiated and launched the Ringier Equal Voice Initiative, which aims to make women more visible in media coverage and promote gender equality. The core of the initiative is the equal voice factor, an algorithm that makes equality measurable. We like to hear that things are measurable. Dr. Basler, could you then, the question that we've posed to you is if you could explain to us a bit of how equal voice works and how the initiative came to focus specifically on measuring women's visibility in media as the sort of critical factor in measuring equality.
Thanks a lot for having me here. It's a big pleasure. Let me start with a little anecdote. It took place on the last evening of our Christmas vacations with family and friends. The kids were listening, were hearing that we were discussing about data, about artificial intelligence. And my son asked me, what is ChatGPT? And then I said, let's try it. And the next week was his birthday. So I said, let's ask ChatGPT what to get for your birthday. So we asked it, and the ChatGPT said for a 9-year-old son or a boy, you could give him a video games, a photo camera, or a smartphone. You can imagine Leo's eyes sparkling. Next to him was sitting a girl, and she said, oh, let's do the same question for me as well. Well, the answer, a dollhouse, a pencil case, or a cookbook. You can imagine how disappointed the children were. And it was our son who said, this is so unfair. A week later, I wanted to prepare for the World Economic Forum for my speech there in Davos. And I told my team, let's take a more sophisticated example. Let's ask ChatGPT what career you would recommend for women. And the answer were healthcare, education, and technology. And for men, it was engineering, manufacturing, and technology. So this example shows artificial intelligence already has a big bias in it. The interesting point was we re-asked one week later, and ChatGPT had already learned. So this is a good news. But anyhow, what does it show? It shows how important the source of artificial intelligence is. And the source are all the data from society, from science, from media that we get. So that's why we are convinced that the initiative we launched at Ringier, Equal Voice, is so important in order to change the system in the media sector. Are you aware that 82% of media coverage is about men? So 18 left over for women. And with sports, it's even worse. 4% of sports media coverage, it's about women. So being aware that 40% of the athletes are women. So we at Ringier, we are a Swiss-based media company. We are located in 19 countries. We hold 140 companies. We said, let's change it. Seeing is believing. Let's show all the role models that we have. And there are great role models around. We want to break the bias, the gender bias. We want to show in our media male kindergarten teachers and female engineers. How are we doing this? We use this algorithm. It's an in-house developed algorithm that counts real time how often women or media are shown in text, pictures, and videos. And it does make a change because this is our USP, because we use the data. And suddenly, a rather emotional discussion, and diversity inclusion is still an emotional discussion, became totally rationalized. Equally important as the factor is the equal voice frame. And this is the question how women are portrayed in media, what pictures are shown, or what questions are being addressed. We are really happy about the development. We started 3 years ago, and let me show you some examples. Handelszeitung is the biggest business newspaper in Switzerland, and we started with an equal voice factor of 17%. We are now around nearly 30%. So it shows a development. Apart from this, we are really proud that we can offer equal voice as a service, not only to media companies, Axel Springer is part of those media companies, but as well to other companies. So all of you could use equal voice to have a deeper look at your press releases that you are doing. Apart from this, we are so happy that we could spread this idea of equal voice to the businesses in Switzerland. We have created something, a network. It's called Equal Voice United. It's 15 companies in Switzerland. Among those, for example, are Credit Suisse, are the Post, it's Migros, it's eBay, it's MasterCard, on. So it's really interesting. Those companies have committed themselves to start a movement to make gender equality a reality in Switzerland. And the good thing about it, they are not only doing it, but they communicate about it. So it does make a difference. So what are our biggest learnings so far? We noticed data is key. What you treasure, you rather measure. Second, we noticed we all have an unconscious bias in us, don't we? So it's our responsibility to get aware of those unconscious bias we all have and resolve them. And last but not least, it's really interesting, but strengthening the S in the ESG has a business impact as well. So what is in for you? First of all, diversity inclusion, it's a leadership topic, nothing to delegate to HR. Let's take it serious and walk the talk internally. Let's start with ourselves. Second, let's change the system together. Let's listen to all those different voices. Let's have an equal voice, and let's raise up and stand up to give an equal voice. And last but not least, let's be a role model. We all need all of you to be role models for equality. Thanks.
And I think it's an interesting theme that's developing here, and that it's the Equal Voice initiative is extremely important, but it's really how you use that data that makes the difference. So we need people to commit, but we also need institutions and companies to do so. And as you say, it's not just about doing it; it's about communicating it and leading the way. Data is key. What you treasure, you better measure. Is that
exactly.
that's a great. Great line. Wonderful. So now we'll move on to Ms. Sophie Ackermann. Sophie Ackermann has been Managing Director of Alliance F, a federation of Swiss women's organizations since May 2018. She is a former Swiss youth delegate to the United Nations and was co-responsible for setting up the youth parliament of the city of Bern. In 2019, she launched Stop Hate Speech, a project of Alliance F that uses technology and crowdsourcing to detect and counter hate speech online. Sophie's also president of Tech Against Violence, an organization that develops digital solutions against violence that launched its first online tool, With You Against Domestic Violence and Toxic Relationships, in 2022. Sophie, what we've posed to you, we were talking about your algorithm earlier. Could you tell us a bit more about how these digital solutions you've been working with, how they work, and how do you see the potential for these innovative technologies to be deployed across regions? We've been sort of not talking so much about the global context, and how do you see that working across different regions, different levels of tech literacy? The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for the question, and thanks a lot to the ambassador and Switzerland and the whole mission who worked a lot for having me here. Thanks a lot to the IPI. So yes, let me tell you some stuff about the project before I go on to the algorithm. So Stop Hate Speech was formed 2019, as we heard, with the aim that all people could use the internet without fear of violence and hate, and at best also improve the discourse on the internet. This should also contribute to stable democracy where everyone feels safe to express their minds. What we try to do at Stop Hate Speech is we try to connect civil society, science, and cutting-edge technology. Together with the ETH of Zurich and a community of over 1,200 volunteers, we programmed an algorithm named BotDog. BotDog is visualized as a small puppy. It's a dog. And dogs has to be trained, that they understand how and what they have to do. So that's what we did. We actually programmed an app, which is more or less a Tinder for hate speech, where people could swipe left or right to tell us whether a comment for them is hate speech or not. With that data and data from our research partners, in the end, it was more than 400,000 annotations of comments. BotDog actually grew and found out what actually is hate speech or not. We use that information to send BotDog out to the internet and social media to report how big this problem of hate speech actually is, because there is not so much data, specifically not in Switzerland. And then also maybe a bit proactive, we also looked at possibilities, what we can change or what can help to counter hate speech. And I would like to give you some updates or some findings which we made. 95% of all hate speech comments in Switzerland, in Twitter, and in the comment section of media houses are written by 5% of the users. The same 5% users on the comment section in the media is responsible for 50% of all comments written and sent in. That means what we often see and feel that a large majority, or at least half of the population, is really hateful. That's just not true. And that's a very important finding, which we also saw. And that is that even for newspapers, even if they have 50% female readers, it's just 10% of women who would actually engage in the comment section and would write comments. So women are once again left out in a very important part of our digital democracy. I think those are already very important numbers to know. Also to know that the problem might be big, but it's also not impossible to do something against it. When we look at the possibilities to counter hate speech, our research partner, the ETH of Zurich, conducted 3 experiments, and they all shown more or less the same, that if we do counter speech in an empathy-based way, that means we are not showing empathy with the people that are actually doing hate speech, but the targeted group of hate speech, it really has an impact. So people would more often delete their hate speech tweet, sometimes even say they're sorry, that happens also on the internet, and not tweet more hate speech for the next 4 weeks. So that means actually we can do something against that hate speech, which is already good. Also, we saw that people are less likely to like a hate speech tweet when someone did a counter speech tweet. So it's not that much impossible as we might think to do something against hate speech, which is good news. To come back to your question, also what could be the role of the UN, maybe very personal anecdote. 8 years ago, I was here at the youth representative with the delegation of Switzerland, and I was asked to hold a side event, which I did, and the topic was hate speech against women. So actually all my career is because of the UN, more or less. So thank you for that already. That's a very, on a personal level. I mean, On another level, we need resources and we need collaborations, and we need to talk more. This is clear. I want also to say that we need media houses and social media to be part of it. And I want to point out that Ringier and Alabella Basler was in our project a very important part, because they were incredibly open and helpful, and we would have never succeeded without also the help of the private sector. But we also do need to talk about regulations, I think. We will never come across that. We have talked before, it's also not too easy, because even in Switzerland, we're a small country, but we do speak different languages, but it's not just a different language, it's also a different culture. And we cannot just translate an algorithm in another language. Language is more than words. So in every region, we have to retrain an algorithm to understand what exactly is okay to say in that region, what is not. So there is no easy fix. I have to be sorry about that, but yeah. So it means we need to give a lot of input. But what we can do, and I think we can do this all around the world, is to tell people that it's not 50%, it's 5%. And everyone needs to know that if they're silent, this 5% might be 10% in 10 years. So it's actually our responsibility to speak up our minds, to be empathy-based with the targeted group and do counter speech. And I think this is going for all around the world, could be the same. Thank you.
Great thing. I think this final point is that it's it's 95% is written by 5% of users, and so we have to realize that it's not the 50%. However, 5% is not small, and if we don't actually counter them, they'll be bigger in the future. And maybe we can talk a little bit about this in the Q&A. But it's interesting to me, this point that you make about countering hate speech, because we're talking about measuring how hate speech, identifying hate speech, measuring equal voices, gender equality and such. But there's a certain debate that we've seen in the discussions around misinformation and disinformation, where is the tactic to counter this? Is it limiting that speech, or is it empowering users in order to counter it? And there's some debate on that in the tech sector, it seems. Wonderful. We have a good amount of time, 48 minutes or so for Q&A. The floor is open. We also have a Q&A function on our webinar for people that are watching online. Please submit your questions. And if no one is going to jump in, I have a couple myself. I'd like to, we're here at IPI, we're across the street from the United Nations. And other than talking about the Global Digital Compact, we haven't talked too much about the multilateral system. I started in this conversation saying how much I like CSW because of all the civil society engagement, and I'm wondering, I'm looking over at our Secretary General's tech envoy at this question, but I would welcome others to jump in. How can the UN system on this incredible issue collaborate with, learn from, engage with civil society on this issue, to utilize technology at the local level? You know, we've been talking sort of in abstract terms, but I would imagine both regionally and also sub-regionally and nationally, it really differs among layers of tech literacy, access and such, and how can the UN help to bridge civil society governance on these issues?
Thanks, Adam. And let's stick with Adam and Amandeep. It'll be easier for you to.
Yeah. Absolutely.
All right. I think that's happening already in a significant way. So all digital discussions, for instance, have been multi-stakeholder right from the start, and civil society has been a very important stakeholder. For instance, if you look at the consultations for the Global Digital Compact, civil society has contributed a lot of insights from the ground, those context-sensitive, context-specific insights that you mentioned. And civil society would also have an important role in how the Global Digital Compact's principles, its action framework, are translated into real world impact. We will not be able to measure that point about what we measure progress on those principles if we didn't have people to keep us honest, whether we are governments or the private sector. Now, we often get away with very stock phrases and stock responses. So it's civil society's duty, it's academia's responsibility to keep us honest with feedback from the ground, with research into what is actually happening. And also a very important factor, because we've been talking about data and algorithms and AI oracles. For instance, I won't ask AI to tell me, give me advice on some things, because that really confuses what AI is supposed to do. It's pattern recognition. It has had a great impact in terms of internet search, in terms of optimization of how we present ads, etc. But now we are kind of getting into this delusion as if it is, we are anthropomorphizing this, as if it's a companion, it is an oracle, it has the answers to all our problems, and all those answers are coming from data that's already out there. Now, in anthropology, in social sciences, we know that social silences say a lot. We were discussing this in the pre-meeting. Bourdieu talked about those silences, and they often reflect the asymmetries of power, who is talked about and how, and who's not talked about and how. So if we are going to rely on what is already out there, then we are going to live in a very partial world. It's not going to be inclusive enough, and the digital technologies that we develop are not going to be meaningful enough for the large numbers of people who are not contributing their data, or who are not generating content, or who are merely consumers of content. And there again, a multi-stakeholder approach is going to be essential. And the UN can provide that kind of a neutral, independent platform. The UN doesn't have a national axe to grind or a commercial axe to grind. It can provide that space for reinforcing collaboration across borders, reinforcing collaboration across stakeholder domains, and helping, because in the digital world, you cannot write laws for everything. You cannot treat it through the regular tool sets of multilateral work, international treaties, resolutions, etc. So the UN can provide a space whereby international guidance, principles such as the proposed Global Digital Compact, those charters, can be aligned with national practice, and then onward at the third layer with the practice of industry. Thanks.
Thank you. That is extremely important. I mean, this point on AI, that it is data that's out there, and that I think connects up with what you were describing in your story about GPT. But what's interesting is that you described how it changed, and so it's a question not just of how you access the data, but it's whose data, whose content, and how that content is generated. We've done some work with Microsoft on universal connectivity and issues related to universal connectivity. And one of the key points that came out in conversations with particular communities in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere is that they don't just want the internet to access the internet. They want to access the internet to create their own internet, to create their own content. And this is becomes, in my mind, extremely more important when you say we're putting out this AI there, but it's going to work with what's already there and learn from it. Annabelle, you seem to, did you want to jump in there? Yes, please.
I have two questions. One from Mr. Bachanan. I found your statistics extraordinarily insightful. Thank you for sharing them. I was wondering whether you had any idea about why women engage less in commenting on social media. That would be really helpful to understand that. And then I'll have a question for you also, Dr. Basler.
Should we answer that?
You can. go ahead.
So my second question is then, how would you think about the business models of some media, also on social blogs and so forth, that actually make it a business model to post negative articles and also to incite hate comments against all types of events, corporations, people, individuals, really very broadly. I'd be really interested in hearing a media representative reflect on, is that a viable business model? How can society think about it in a more constructive way?
Thank you for your question. So first of all, it's not from social media, it's from media. And I think that's already a big difference. We don't know, but we're trying to find out. I think, but that's very unscientific, but I'm an activist, so I can be very unscientific, that's okay. We see that women, if it's articles about maybe more lifestyle, there are much more women commenting. So it's a feeling of being the majority that they often don't engage as much. Maybe it would help if they think that other women, I mean, usually it's also not too easy to spot women because they're not using their names, right? So that's what we're trying to find out, for instance, to see in experiments whether we pin a comment of a woman on top, if that would have an impact on other women feeling okay to also be a part of the discussion. And then maybe it might change when women feel that they're maybe 30% in the discussion, maybe we'll also change discussion, we'll see. But yeah, we're trying to find it out, and maybe I can come back in a few years and tell you what we found out.
In regards to a business case, hate speech should never ever be a business case. And I think it's a responsibility of media companies to be aware of it and to change it in case it was. But I want to frame it differently and in a positive manner for Equal Voice. What we found out is that it can become a positive business case. Why so? We are saying showing role models is really interesting, and not only the old type of role models, as well new. And this is interesting. We saw an increase in the reach of our daily newspaper. So the reach is now 50% of the audience is female, 50% is male. Secondly, we noticed subscription rates all over the world in media are decreasing, no doubt about this. But we noticed that at this Handelszeitung, the example I did before of the business newspaper, we saw increases in female subscription audience. And last but not least, we noticed that companies, they depend upon the context as well, where their advertising is placing. And Equal Voice gives a safe content. So I rather see it as a positive case. If you can change the system, it has a positive business impact as well.
Jeffrey, please.
Thank you. Jeff Laurenti, UNA, USA, Princeton. Particularly the last remark that Ms. Bassler raised about advertising and its impact, both in supporting social media exchanges and such, is one perhaps we might get into a bit more, because I haven't thought of a question on that yet, but it must be important. What I do wonder is what the data are that scholarly inquiry has been able to assess in terms of the gender imbalances in social media and media more generally, electronically, in the tech world. Is this primarily derived from North America, Europe? What are the data that one is able to see from South Asia, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America? Are there differences in the kinds of representation of women and their participation in those regions that may reflect something different than the kind of the first world, so-called, or the North? And is there a difference one sees in areas of conflict in terms of either a spike in kind of misogynistic comment, or perhaps now that the boys are out killing each other, they have more important things to do and they drop in that. So could you give us some sense of those dimensions, please?
Yeah, I'm going to try, although I don't think I'm going to do justice to your question. We certainly see different patterns of gender imbalance in technology. I think that was your question across the world. And a very interesting example, because broadly speaking, we might argue culturally, because the problem always is there's so many differences between countries, so how can I even say anything? But I'm focusing on Germany for a moment, because some of the most interesting research came out of Germany, because again, arguably speaking, broadly Eastern and Western Germany had the same language, and there was a wall in between, and they developed very differently. So women were much more likely to study STEM topics, or much more in Eastern Germany, much more likely to study STEM fields, much more likely to become engineers, much more likely to do technology. So there are interesting, interesting comparisons that you can make, and it starts very, very early. I mean, Annabella already mentioned those stereotypes. We would say normally between 4 and 6, it is when children, boys and girls and non-binary, start to develop those stereotypes about what is an appropriate role for me, and when they start to associate men with technology and women with nursing. And then the question, of course, is what happens at that time. And partly it is, I mean, again, it goes back to Annabella's earlier point. It is seeing is believing, in that partly it is the books, the cartoons, the media they consume, the fairy tales that, we tell them about. So sometimes I think, and I'm just obviously you can see visually thinking of the Brother Grimms, and I didn't want to say it because I didn't want to trash history, but I'm going to trash history for a moment. Sometimes we have to hurry history. I don't want to call it trash history. Sometimes we have to hurry history. And I think I'm actually, if I may, I'm going to just add a comment on our discussion before. That is a problem with machine learning. I mean, we just have to acknowledge that with data that is trained on the past, we are replicating the past. That is just a fact. So then we have to think hard about what to do. And the more developed algorithms I'm aware of, they add the second stage where then they reweight the input that they use. When they see the past has been particularly male and pale, then they might increase the sample of non-male and pale people in the world to get a better sense of what a representative sample would look like. So I do think tinkering, I'm literally, as an academic, I'm saying that, but tinkering with the data a little bit, right? Because if I build an algorithm based on the leaders at Harvard in the last 350 years to predict what the next president of Harvard should look like, yeah. So that's something, sometimes you have to hurry history. So I jumped a little bit and combined your question with something that I feel strongly about. And I think we should just acknowledge that. And not throughout machine learning. It's an amazing tool. I'm a big fan of technology, but that's what I'm saying. We need to test. I mean, ChatGPT, Annabella, I had no idea. I'm like, how is that so possible? It's like the absence of female dummies. How could that not have been tested beforehand? How did you have to find out? How did they not realize that they're just replicating the past? And maybe that's what they want to do. But then at least we should be clear about that, if that's what we want to do.
We are testing it for them. We are the guinea pigs. Yeah. I think if this data, this one field in which there's plenty of globally disaggregated data, that's mobile phone. So if you look at GSMA's latest report, they have it country-wise, region-wise. What are the 5 main reasons why, for example, you have this gender digital divide with regard to access to mobile internet? But the question you asked, I don't think we have that kind of data, and that's why it's important to measure, define the right metrics, and have those objective inputs brought into international discussions. And I can't resist, just jumping in on this, this past as a predictor of future. In some domains, it works very well. When you are in a purely commercial domain, when you are going to predict sales or how the real estate market is going to develop. But let's not use it to set our social, cultural, political direction, because that's foolish. That's not wise. And there, our traditional wisdom, I think, is very important. Several thousand years ago, the Buddha said, be in the moment, forget your past conditioning. That's where the wise response to the current context comes. But if we are going to let the past determine our present actions and our future, then we are not being wise. And that's, with all the smartness today, I think we are losing some of that human wisdom. And that's why the gender issues for me, not only about doing right by women, it's also about transdisciplinarity. It's also about the nurturing, the collaborative aspect of technology, not the masculine, aggressive, extractive aspect of technology. And frankly, it reminds me of what Ada Lovelace, and we're talking about tech this week, and so we have to remember the world's first programmer, who was a woman, and was patronized for being a great conversationalist. And she was a great mathematician, period. And she used to talk about poetical science, which is science and maths, our famous STEM, enriched by humanities, by this wisdom, which is very human. Without that, I'm afraid we are going to get lost. What you see with ChatGPT today is perhaps just 5% of what's coming. It's there in the labs, and there are people who are working in these companies, and when you talk to them and you look at some of these beta products that are in the pipeline, wow. So we better get ready.
Excellent, thank you. We've got two questions here. We'll take that one there, and then the one from, we'll go right to the person in front. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Pina Rose from the UN Department of Management, Strategy, Policy and Compliance. I do have a question for Professor Bonnet, if you allow. I believe it was you, Dr. Basler, who mentioned that, especially in the space of diversity and inclusion, sometimes it can get a little emotional. I hear you very much, working in that area as well. And I wonder whether maybe insights from behavioral sciences could help also to rationalize that space a little bit. And maybe to what extent, Professor Bonnet, you would have some insights to share with us on how technology could help scaling it. Thank you.
If you could just pass the mic. Yeah.
Should I ask now? Question for Dr. Bonnet and Dr. Basler as well. And using the chat GPT algorithm as an example, is there any difference in the developers of algorithms when it comes to gender bias? So if you have an all-male team developing an algorithm, a split gender team, or an all-female team, do you notice different outcomes, or is it more of a data issue?
Yeah, I'm happy. Maybe I'm going to start with the first question, and then I'm turning it over to Annabella. So first of all, I never disagree with Annabella, but I'm going to do it a little bit. A little bit of emotions is not bad. You can see I'm very passionate about gender equity. So a little bit of emotion is okay. But I think what behavioral science really helps us is kind of understanding what triggers emotional responses, what triggers more reflective responses. So in behavioral economics, we often, or more generally in behavioral science, we distinguish between system 1 and system 2 thinking. One is a bit more reflective, a bit more rational in quotation marks, and one is more kind of instinctive, gut-based, intuitive. And intuition is not always wrong. It often is wrong. It's not always wrong. But if someone, God forbid, is going to shout fire, we shouldn't wait for our reflective system to analyze, well, should we run? Should we stay? Should we talk? Should we, we should move. We should do things. But most, in many, many cases, sadly, that, that system that is based on our guts, our instincts, does lead us astray. That is the home of stereotypes that is the home of these heuristics, these shortcuts, as in, what's my stereotype about Swiss? Well, they like chocolates, they like mountains, they like cheese, they're on time. I'm gonna stop here. But I'm just saying, so that, right, that, and then but then the real question, and that I think is where behavioral science is incredibly useful, is to acknowledge that that's happening. That is how our brains are wired over thousands and thousands of years. And there were times when it was very productive for us to have these instinctive responses, like big thing coming, running my direction, probably I should run too. But we can break, and that's where, again, the human impact is so important. We can break the impact of our unconscious minds on our behaviors. Like, it doesn't mean that I have to act on those types of beliefs. And that's where technology can be incredibly helpful. Because sometimes, including like the tool that I use in my classroom, it literally does help me. It makes it easier for me, my biased mind, but also, and I think that's also true for both of your tools, actually, knowing there's a tool, knowing that somebody watches me, knowing that I'm measured, already helps me reflect. And I'm more likely to, for example, count to 5 before I call on someone. So that's kind of a rule of thumb that I have adopted now to not fall into that trap. So I think the first thing is we have to acknowledge that, yes, we make these emotional responses. They're sometimes okay, but sometimes they just do lead us astray. And then we have to think of clever ways to disrupt the impact of those instincts on our behaviors, right? And that could be, some people have a hard time getting up in the morning, and they might have 5 alarm clocks, including one at the other side of the apartment, because they know they can't get out of the room, out of the bed, otherwise. So that's kind of breaking, right? The impact of my instinct to just cuddle up and turn over, break that link between that instinct and what I'm actually going to do.
In regards to your questions, the tech teams, we are lucky at Ringier that we have women and men working on this algorithm. And so that's why it's this question we can say, yeah, it works. But on the journalistic point of view, we had a big debate on this, because when we started with Equal Voice, we noticed some journalists thought, oh, this is now a women topic, so we should ask all our female journalists to be part of it. And this was not the idea behind. We wanted to have equal teams to write about it, to think about it, to look through their notebook and reflect, oh, what great role models do I have and do I know? So it was really interesting that we said, no, we want all of you to write it, to make women or to make role models more visible. So I think it's really important that it's not only one specific group covering the whole topic, but that you have a diversity in these teams. And it's really interesting, by doing this at Ringier, when we started, we noticed that we are attracting now talents from different fields that are aware of Equal Voice and say, oh, you are doing Equal Voice. So yeah, it's interesting, because we want to ensure that we do walk the talk internally and externally.
Excellent, thank you. I think that there's a sub in this conversation. We're sort of assuming in some ways that there's this problem and then we want to address it. But there's sort of a political question here to me, in that we have this ability to recognize that we have these internal bias, but some actors don't have an interest or an incentive to confront that bias, because that bias actually is embedded within a system which they benefit from. Right? So in some sense, it gets back to me to the sort of question of incentives, whether it's market-based or regulation. You Amandeep said you can't write laws for everything in the digital space, but is there a role here for government? And also, in my mind, this connects up to the question of actual violence, not just online violence. The question was posed about how does this play out in conflict environments. And we've done some work on the necessity to ensure the safety and security of women in political spaces in order to facilitate their participation. And I think that is something that probably you see manifested online as well. Sophie, we were discussing earlier about the Stop Hate Speech initiative, and you made an interesting distinction to me that's relevant in this question, is that there's a difference between toxic participation online and hate speech. And this sort of ties into one of the points made on our online audience from Jose Garcia, doesn't have an affiliation, about how you fix these systems when you have people that are, in this sense, kind of invested in the status quo and continuing. How do you in your work see this play out?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's already important to really say that there's toxic language and there's hate speech. And toxic language might not be fun, but it's also not as harmful as hate speech for a democracy. But still, I know that a lot of newspapers still doesn't want to have slur words on their platforms, but I really think for governments, it has a different, we also have to choose a different approach. What we do in our algorithm is that it's not a yes or no. So it's not that it says, yes, this is hate speech. No, this is not. It's like from 1 to 10, and everything under 5, it's probably okay, and everything up to 10 is not okay, and 10 is certainly not okay. What we see in Switzerland is that our laws are not extremely strict. That means we can be quite sexist without being punished. So we didn't want to also here not just have the status quo, maybe be a bit going in the future and saying that's exactly not what we want for a stable democracy. So sorry, now I dropped the ball. What was it?
No, well, I guess my question is, and it's really to everybody in some ways, is that we're talking about technological tools to measure equality, measure hate speech, understand the digital environment. Amandeep made the point about laws regulating this space. IPI participated in the Munich Security Conference last month. And I was at a panel with Kirsti Kaljulaid, the former president of Estonia. And she made an interesting point on this question in some way. She said, in Estonia, legally, they're at the point where they're not really distinguishing between hate speech online or hate speech in the public sphere. It's all one thing. And we have laws and roles for the government to enforce anti-hate speech laws. As you say, it's one thing to call somebody a bad name, but if you identify a whole group as somehow noxious to the public space, that has an impact on democracy, on the political sphere. So I guess my question is a political one, in that how do we, when we're thinking about the tactics, the strategy of how we are going to use technology to advance gender equality, which is under attack in many contexts, what is the role for government, I guess?
Okay, well,
but that wasn't, did you think I was going?
Okay, the last part, okay, at the last part, I'm teacher at the School of Government, but I have to add, a third component, because we talked about civil society beforehand, and I think, Sophie, what you're doing, one of the most hopeful things I've heard today was the 5%. And the 5% is so important to me, because what you do is what I call norm entrepreneurship. We don't only care about incentives, that is financial. We don't only care about laws, but we also want to be liked. We care about social approval. We care about social disapproval, right? And very often we perpetrate norms by kind of repeating the same stories. So let me explain that. So when we always talk about the absence of women, sometimes describing the world can turn into a prescription in what the world should look like in our minds. And that's why norm entrepreneurship, actually, and I think we're trying to do that a little bit, is to talk about kind of the positive examples, the things that we can improve, but also highlight, for example, that 95% of the people are not hate speakers, at least not most of the time. You know, I'm sure, you know, many people are at some point, but I'm just saying that is important to say. The movement, the thing to do is not to do this. It is a large majority that is not doing this. And people who are speaking up against that small minority that is violating our norms should be celebrated. They should also be highlighted as in, look, what a hero this is, heroine, she is. So I just wanted to add to our collective, you know, toolbox of motivators. It is, you know, it's money. It's also the law, but it's also social norms. And we all, and including, of course, the media, plays a role in shaping what we think is normal, is acceptable. And Me Too is actually a great example of how things that used to be normal have become increasingly less normal. So the question was about government, but I just wanted to add the norms as well.
Yeah, if I, you know, governments definitely have a role. Public policy matters. I mean, you have research. We're talking about evidence like Uruguay, for instance. So you have this typical S curve. So you can let it rip. And then, you know, one section, let's say we're talking about gender today, men will go this way and women will follow with a line. But when you bring public policy in, good public policy in, then at least the trend converges at some stage. They don't stay apart. So inclusion can be driven by public policy. You can build good digital public infrastructure, digital public goods to drive inclusion, to put safeguards in place on which both the public and the private sector can play. So that's public policy driven. But governments alone will not be able to solve this. You have to work with the private sector, you have to work with civil society, but governments cannot cede their role away. You get embedded, we're talking about embedding in a tech paradigm. Try ripping out the internal combustion engine today. You know, we're having so much trouble because that paradigm, that technology choice, we had a choice at that time between electric and the internal combustion engine. We went one way, and that's how our cities got designed. You know, look at the US, for instance. That's how, you know, our energy industry involved, so many other things. Those have consequences. Today, with regard to technology, we are again at a crossroads. So we have to choose wisely before the externalities just roll over, and then someone else will have to pick up the private sector will not pick up the tab on that. Governments will have to, because you know, if there are job losses, for instance, shifts in jobs, then governments will have to respond to it. So why wait for that to happen? Today we need smart regulation that cuts across governments, civil society, and the private sector. In India, they even have a term for it. It's called Samaj Sarkar Bazaar, which is market, government, and civil society. So you have to do smart regulation across these sectors before the externalities get baked in, the paradigm gets baked in. Try pulling, I mean, today you cannot do without Twitter and Facebook because they're part of your infrastructure for information exchange, for freedom of expression. And you can't just handle it through, like today, when the content discussion, if you go too far in one direction, then, you know, there is consequences for human rights, you know, internet shutdowns. People will say, this is bad content, you know, it may be hateful speech, but then you go over the line and then, you know, you suppress freedom of expression. So this is something that governments can't just fix by law. You have to work together with the others.
Thank you. I think we could have one more round of questions, and then we'll come back for final comments. One thing about that you just said is, you know, it's about government, but of course, I'm always interested in the multilateral system. And I think this last point that you made makes the point for the digital compact, but also for this whole process as the Secretary General is engaged in on our common agenda to reimagine the multilateral system as more effective and networked. One of the critiques of the multilateral system over time is not only that it doesn't incorporate civil society, but that it's too state-based. And this issue seems to be, along with issues related to health and others, is so clearly one that states themselves cannot handle alone, that you need a multi-stakeholder approach in order to address any of these issues, in particular because, of course, the private sector is at the center of this. If there's any final questions? Yes, there in the back, please.
Thank you very much. Muhammad Ibrahim from Department of Peace Operations, Peacekeeping. Actually, I just came from Afghanistan a couple of months ago dealing with Taliban trying to enhance gender mainstreaming there. And I tried to do my homework before going by trying to see how could I convince very stubborn Taliban group about the role of women. And they are very religiously motivated. I tried to do the research online about like data about the role of women in Islam. I found it very weak. And that's the issue that I want to raise again, like the necessity of having gender lens for the data that we do research on. Because if it's not for my expertise, I managed to get some examples, but it was extremely weak. And I agree with you when you look at ChatGPT. Again, what you data existing, it dictate what's the result. So that's why I think the gender lens, even for religious database, will make a lot of difference in our practical work in peacekeeping on the ground in a very difficult environment dealing with radical groups. It was just a comment, not an example. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And there's any final questions? We'll turn back to the panel for final comments. And I think that's a good sort of, in some sense, final comment in that we're looking for concrete examples. One of our goals for this event has been to think about the way, concrete ways that we can think about innovation technology to advance our goals on gender equality. And I think the data point has been widely agreed upon here. So why don't we start here, Annabelle, and then give you any final remarks before we close.
I think the most important is be aware of your unconscious bias. My little son was asking when it was my 10th anniversary of being a CFO, he asked me if men could be CFOs as well, because he only knew me, right? So I think it's really important that we are all aware of our unconscious bias, then we can change them. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's just really to encourage civil society once again that they played a role in this. I also think that governments, they have a role, but I also think that the civil society has one. And it's better maybe not to give all of the decision to social media, whether people are allowed to be on social media or not, but we could prove that counter speech has an impact. So we should all use it and raise our voices.
I just want to advocate for greater feminization of the entire digital economy value chain, from education to access to content development, to data and AI, all the way to governance. And I think if we don't move away from this kind of overly masculine development of technology, then the planet is in danger and our societies, our democracies are in danger.
So I'm going to complement what was said before and take more of a very micro view at this point, in that I think we have been talking very much at the systems level today. And of course, I'm a huge proponent of fixing the system. But sometimes that message is perceived as, oh, then it's not about me, because I'm not a designer of algorithms. I'm not a designer of technology. I don't, et cetera, et cetera. And so just before you leave, I want to make sure you don't leave with that you all are norm entrepreneurs. We all are norm entrepreneurs in everything we do, in who we invite to speak on a panel, how we run our meetings, how we include people who attend virtually, how we respond to somebody who tells us that they're expecting a baby. Just, all of these things are shaping what we think is the norm, is acceptable. And we all, norms by definition are collective responsibility. And therefore, please do shape norms to make our world a more inclusive place.
Excellent, thank you. It's a wonderful way to end. I believe this has been it's been a panel about technology, but really this human element has been at the core of everything that we've been talking about. And I've been asked to then leave you because, as Ira said, it's not about us, it's not about the system, it's about you. And so we want to continue this conversation online and encourage you to continue brainstorming about what are the next steps for addressing gender inequality in media, and share your thoughts on social media. Tag IPI, tag International Gender Champions, Swiss UN, and we can keep this conversation going because it is fundamentally important for this issue, for advancing gender equality, for achieving SDG 5, and for the entire world, as Amandeep has said. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you.